Good speakers are audience-centered. They understand the primary purpose of public speaking is to gain a desired response from their listeners. Speakers who are audience-centered keep 3 questions in mind as they prepare their speeches. First, to whom am I speaking? For this class, you are speaking to your classmates. But outside the class, you might be speaking to a group of doctors, your friends and family, your boss and coworkers, or any number of other groups. Second, what do I want the audience to know, believe, or do as a result of my speech? This is what informs your specific purpose statement, such as to inform your audience the best way to make a quesadilla, or to persuade your audience to become involved in local politics. Finally, how can I most effectively compose and present my speech to accomplish that aim? These 3 things seek to create a bond with listeners by emphasizing common values, goals, and experiences. As you prepare your speeches, it's important for student speakers to approach their classmates as a real audience. Because the classroom seems like an artificial speaking situation, it's easy for students to lose sight of their classmates as an authentic audience. The best student speakers take their audience seriously and treat their classmates as worthy of their best effort. The first stage of audience analysis is examining demographic traits of the audience and how they might affect reception of the speech. But when doing so, it's important to avoid stereotyping. The term stereotype was coined by journalist Walter Lippmann to mean pictures in our heads. Stereotypes are the oversimplified image of a group. Stereotypes aren't necessarily bad and not necessarily false, but ultimately they can cause harm by assuming that all members of a group are alike. Let's look at one of the more innocuous stereotypes, that all tall people play basketball. Let's assume you're going to give a persuasive speech on how basketball players should skip college and go straight from high school to the NBA. If everyone in your class was over 6 feet tall, except for your 5'3" instructor, of course, you might assume that since all tall people play basketball, everyone in your class already knows most of your arguments, so you will skip over some more basic information. But not all tall people play basketball, or have any interest in the sport. Lots of shorter people play basketball as well. The point is that assuming someone with a specific identity, especially a race, gender, religion, nationality, etc., all believe and all behave a certain way, dismisses a person as an individual. Let's take a look at a few demographics you can consider when preparing your speech. Few things affect a person's outlook more than age. Each generation has more or less common experiences and values. Effective speakers adapt to these experiences and values when addressing an audience, keeping also in mind the varying age groups an audience might hold. Gender identity is another demographic to consider. Gender issues can have a strong impact on how an audience responds to a speech. To be effective in today's world, public speakers must avoid outdated gender stereotypes and not automatically assume everyone has a binary male or female gender identity. You can address this by using non-gendered language like folks instead of ladies and gentlemen, or parent instead of mother and father. It's important to adapt to the audience on the basis of sexual orientation. Audience-centered speakers avoid words and phrases that demean people on the basis of sexual orientation. They also avoid examples and other supporting materials that may unintentionally exclude listeners with same-sex partners. Use words like partner instead of girlfriend or boyfriend, and spouse instead of husband or wife. If a woman tells you she is married, for example, you can't automatically assume she's married to someone of the opposite sex. the religious views of the audience need to be considered. Speakers cannot assume their religious views, whatever they may be, will be shared by all members of the audience. Failure to consider the religious views of the audience can seriously weaken a speech. It's also important to consider the racial, ethnic, or cultural background of audience members. Audience-centered speakers are sensitive to the fact that most Americans support racial, ethnic, and cultural diversity as a fundamental element in today's globalized world. Audience-centered speakers are also sensitive to the ways racial, ethnic, and cultural differences among audience members might affect reactions to a speech. The group membership of an audience is another important factor to consider. There are thousands of national, state, and local voluntary associations in the United States. The group affiliations of audience members can provide valuable clues about their interests and attitudes. There are also a number of other potentially important demographic variables. They include occupation, economic position, education, intelligence, and place of residence. Special demographic variables for classroom speeches might include year in school, major, extracurricular activities, job aspirations, and living arrangements. Anything characteristic of a given audience is potentially important to a speaker, trying to gauge how listeners will respond to the speech. Another stage of audience analysis is examining features of the audience unique to the speaking situation at hand, which is called situational analysis. The first factor to consider is the size of the audience. Delivering a speech to a crowd of thousands is different than delivering to your speech class. The second factor to consider is the physical setting of the speech. Do you have a stage and podium? Are you in a business meeting? Or are you delivering your speech over Skype? And the third factor to consider is the audience's disposition toward the topic. A speaker needs to assess the audience's interests, their prior knowledge, and attitude toward the topic, speaker, and occasion. So how do you get information about your audience? There are several ways to get demographic and situational information about the audience. For speeches outside the classroom, speakers often make informal inquiries about their audience. For classroom speeches, students often use audience analysis questionnaires, asking 3 basic types of questions: fixed alternative, scale, and open-ended. Fixed alternative questions offer a choice between 2 or more specific responses, like in this example. Do you know what the insanity plea is in the U.S. legal system? If almost everyone responds with no or not sure, you know you will need to spend more time explaining the insanity plea in your speech. Next are scale questions that allow for a continuum of answers. How often do you believe the insanity plea is used in U.S. court cases? Answers range from very seldom to very often. Finally, open-ended questions give maximum leeway in responding, like, what is your opinion about the insanity plea in U.S. court cases? It will give you lots of information, but it can also take longer to process if you have a large number of questionnaires. Before you give out a questionnaire, there are 4 guidelines for effective audience analysis. First, they should be carefully planned to elicit the necessary information. Ask yourself what information you want and make sure each question you ask gives you that information. They should use multiple types of questions to get the specific and detailed information you need. Asking all scale questions might not get you that information. Your questions should be clear and unambiguous, but they should be relatively brief. Don't ask 10 questions when you can get the information you need in just 5. Once speakers complete their audience analysis, they use that analysis to adapt their speech to their listeners. Most of the work of audience preparation takes place before the speech as part of the preparation process. A speaker should keep the audience in mind at every stage of speech preparation. A speaker should also keep the following questions constantly in mind when preparing the speech. First, how is the audience likely to respond to what I will say? And how can I adjust my message to make it as clear and convincing as possible? Adjusting the message to the audience requires the speaker to anticipate how listeners will respond and be creative in thinking of ways to adapt. Finally, audience adaptation also takes place during the presentation of the speech. No matter how hard the speaker works ahead of time, things may not always go smoothly on the day of the speech. Skillful speakers learn to adapt to these kinds of changes. If you start sneezing or your visual aid keeps falling down, take a breath and roll with it. You can also watch for feedback. If everyone looks confused, you might need to clarify your evidence.